First he was a saint. Afterwards he was an alcoholic, a drunkard, a woman chaser, a very handsome man, charming man. And I don't think so I could resist him if he would make advances to me. But he saved us. In first place, he was our savior.
He was a flamboyant bon viveur, a black marketeer and a gambler, a drinker and womanizer. To the Germans, he was a loyal agent for military intelligence. He was also Oskar Schindler, the man who stole Jews from the Nazis. Under Adolf Hitler, he schemed and prospered and became a very rich man indeed. In Czechoslovakia and Poland, he served Hitler's army as a spy. His munitions factory provided for the Nazi war effort. But Oskar Schindler, by building his own concentration camp, and at great risk to himself, was the only German in the history of the war to save more than 1,000 Jews from the ovens of the death camps. This is the true story of the enigma that was Oskar Schindler. September 1st, 1939, and Adolf Hitler tells an enthusiastic German Reichstag that Germany is to invade Poland. The night before, in a series of faked provocative incidents, a German border radio station had apparently been overrun by Polish soldiers. In reality, these invaders were German soldiers, dressed in Polish army uniforms provided by an agent of the German Abwehr, Oskar Schindler. Later, the triumphant Germans parade through the Polish city of Krakow and declare it the capital of their conquered eastern territories. Krakow, with one of the most established Jewish communities in Europe, quickly feels the impact of the new rulers. Synagogues, where people have worshipped since the 14th century, are closed down, except for propaganda filming purposes. A series of laws are enacted affecting the whole population, but with especially harsh regulations for Jews. Every aspect of life is to be controlled. Jews are expelled from their homes, herded, rounded up with no rights, arbitrary, instant retribution.
I remember being very, very unhappy the first few weeks. It came about the Jewish holidays, and I remember like today standing with my mother in a little synagogue and crying, and they were all strange people around us. But little by little they reduce us to nothing. So
how did they do that, Edgar?
Very systematically. They were coming with all sorts of gimmicks. They, first of all, had what we would call an action. Ever so often, they reduced the amount of people living in ghetto simply by selecting this one will stay and this one will go.
My father and mother, the youngest sister and the youngest brother. The Germans put them on an area in the middle of the town, and they asked the men to go to one side and the women and children on the other side. People knew that the men will go to a camp to work. And my father had decided that he will not leave my mother my brother and a sister. He went over on the other side, and my mother was holding a child in her hand, and my father was holding a child in her hand, and they shot him on the spot. I know it for a fact because a few days later, people who knew my father and mother came to the camp, and they told me the story. They were crying. They felt that they had neglected, and they felt that my father was like the Lester Fines, like a hero. And that's the insanity of it, that we, the innocent, felt guilty what the murderers did to us.
Under the German master plan, one day Krakow, Poland, Europe would be completely Jew-free. Until then, Jewish slave labor could be exploited. Jews without work permits would be rounded up. Work, at least, offered the chance of life.
Walking on one of the streets, I was suddenly stopped by a few SS people that jumped out of a truck and rounded up people. And before we know, we were on the road on to someplace. We didn't know exactly where we were going, but we did wind up in what was later on known to us as the Marienwerke. And at that time, Schindler appeared where the SS guards lined us up for his inspection. He looked at us and he selected me out of the group, picked me out, and he declared to the SS guards that he doesn't want any children. He said it in German, "Ich brauche keine Kinder here." The SS guards replied very quickly that when we bring you people, you keep them, and that they parted with him, and he kept all of us that they delivered.
The Deutsche Emalwarenfabrik of Oskar Schindler, Emalia, to its Jewish workers. A bankrupt business producing enamel kitchenware obtained in December 1939, in the first instance, as a cover for Schindler's intelligence-gathering work. Nothing in the background of the 31-year-old Schindler obviously prepared him for any sort of heroic role. He came from the small industrial town of Zwittau, in the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. He was raised a strict Catholic, although there were Jews in his class at school, and his next-door neighbor was a Jewish rabbi with 2 sons. Young Oscar was an outgoing, non-academic boy who even then enjoyed being the center of attention. As a teenager, he developed a passion for fast cars and motorcycles, in which his father indulged him. And then in 1928 he married Emily, a religious girl from a neighboring village. A small-time salesman during the 30s, he then became a Nazi spy. The Czechs arrested him in August 1938, but he was released after Hitler annexed the Sudetenland. Now, as a member of the National Socialists, he was again free to continue life as the Playboy secret agent.
War ein Mann, der das Leben geliebt hat, ein großer Lebemann. Das muss ich sagen. Die Frauen haben ihm alle gefallen. Gegen eine Frau können sie ankämpfen, aber nicht gegen 10 oder 100 Frauen. Also soll das schwimmen und rennen, ne? Stimmt das? Also mich hat das überhaupt nicht gestört. Sie können einen Menschen nicht ändern, wenn er so ist. Das ist bloß ein Unsinn, wenn sie mit einem Menschen streiten oder wer weiß ich was. Ich habe mit niemandem gestritten. Er liebte die Frauen, er liebte die Gesellschaft, er liebte, was soll ich sagen, manchmal, dass die anderen die Arbeit getan haben. Das hat ihm sehr gut getan, wenn die anderen haben gearbeitet und er hat nichts gemacht.
He was very vain, as we can put it. He liked to put, for example, plenty of perfume on himself. When he went to Monopoly, this was in Krakow, government, part of government agency for the monopoly for liquor, for tobacco and everything. So when he went there, so everybody knew Mr. Schindler is here because the whole hall was, this was the smell of his perfume. Oscar, he liked to have attention from everybody. He liked to be the center of the attraction. he was impulsive, but not in a way that something bad or something, but let's do it, let's go. So, for example, we went to Berlin, and we walk in the streets, and there was a big store with cars. So we were looking through the window. There was a beautiful car, light blue, Horch. So he asked me, shall I buy the car? I said, cool. So go ahead, buy the car. I was laughing. He was not kidding. He just went to the other people, and so they gave him money, and he bought the car.
In occupied Poland, the German businessman with a 17-foot sports car was guaranteed to attract attention, for this was a country of shortages. But by trading up to 90% of his factory's output on the black market, Schindler was able to amass a small fortune. But his own black market purchases were also considerable.
The things Schindler bought on the black market were diamonds, fur coats, beautiful Persian carpets, famous artists' paintings, anything that has a tremendous value at present or even in future, because only this way he could bribe those people what he needed for his particular purpose.
Schindler's particular purpose was far from clear. Daily, his Jews traveled from the ghetto to his factory. Daily they were faced with threats of roundups, or worse. When some of his workers were arrested, he obtained their release by bribing the SS. Using information obtained from top officials, he was able to warn his workers about impending roundups. Then, at the end of 1942, the Germans decided to close the ghetto down. On these fields, on the outskirts of the town, on the site of a Jewish cemetery on Jerusalem Street, a forced labor camp was to be built for those Jews still required to work for the Germans. The Jewish mortuary building was blown up. Jewish prisoners were forced to desecrate the graves of their forefathers to make a road through the camp from tombstones. This was to be Plaszow Forced Labor Camp, home for 20,000 Jewish men, women and children. SS Untersturmführer Amon Goeth, fresh from the liquidation of the Lublin ghettos, was brought to Krakow to run the new camp and supervise the destruction of the remains of Krakow Jewish life.
Amon Goeth himself, with his SS men, was in charge. Elderly women, children, sick people were shot on the spot, and they were brought up with flat trucks into our camp in Plaszow. I myself, with a group of other boys, had to unload the people who were shot. In one case, we asked a German, because a young kid was there and it wasn't dead yet, and we asked her, would you give a Gnade-Schuss? A Gnade. Gnade is the word like a kindness, so we will not bury you alive. And he said, throw it in, it's a schade. He said, it's a shame to waste a bullet on that schmutzig Jude, and we had to pour gasoline over them, and we kept on burning them.
Proudly, the German film units showed their action squads at work. But one German sought to protect his people from the orgy of killing.
On the morning of March 13, 1943, Schindler has told us not to return to the ghetto as we would normally do, but to remain there and make the best of it by sleeping wherever we can, because there was trouble in the ghetto. The ghetto was being liquidated, there's killings going on, and he wants to keep us over that period. During that period, while I was in the factory, staying over for the next 3 nights and worked during days or worked nights, the ghetto was liquidated together with my family of parents, 2 sisters, 2 brothers. The one brother was shot down as he tried to cross from one line to another one. The rest of the family's fate is unknown to me, but I suspect they went to Auschwitz. I have never seen him since
More than 2,000 people died in the ghetto during those days. The survivors began a new life behind barbed wire.
It was frightening. It was very sad. I think the first time I realized that there is no way out. People were committing suicide right then and there. I remember a doctor's mother that took some poison in the same barrack where I was staying. This was the beginning. Then one day they came and they told us to give everything that we own in way of money and jewelry and things like that. And we had to put it on a pile, and this was the end of it.
From his villa inside the camp perimeter, Commandant Amon Goeth did not want for the small luxuries that made life so agreeable for the loyal servants of the Third Reich. That summer of '43 was a warm one. Goeth had soon installed his German mistress, Ruth, in the villa with him. So what was it like for the 24-year-old German, now, as we see, dying from emphysema, surrounded as she was then by the remnants of Krakow's Jewry, the old and the young?
I never see any old people, and I never saw any children. I just saw, I remember one afternoon, there came a big car, and this car was full of children. They went somewhere, and I had a girlfriend there, the wife of Mr. Schindler. And I said, oh, look at that. They are bringing the children somewhere. And I was down, you see, and it went to my heart somehow. And she had herself 2 children. Oh, she said, they're Jews.
To cater for his musical interests, Goeth appointed his own resident musicians from among the inmates, brothers Hermann and Leo Rosner.
I got full dress, I got tuxedo, I got street suit. So whenever I played by the commandant, I used one of those 3, never prisoner's garb. And it depends what kind of party it was. He just called the police, and they told me, Rosner brother, come down. That's it. Usually after killings, to clear his conscience, most of the time he called us. For not long, but parties he played very long.
Soon, a frequent visitor to Goeth's parties was businessman Oskar Schindler. He could captivate all with his easy charm. Schindler, with his reputation for sheltering Jews, had become a close friend of Amon Goeth, the man who had supervised the slaughter in the ghetto and one of the most feared Germans in Krakow.
Amon Goeth took out 50 boys. I was one among them. And we went out to make a garden. And on the way home, one boy had escaped. And when we came in to the gates, and they started counting us, and they saw there was only 49. They wouldn't let us enter, and they called on Goeth. Goeth came down with a few SS, and he was screaming and yelling, "Where's the 50th?" And we act that we don't know. We really didn't know. We couldn't say that we saw him escape. So he took every second one, 25 or 24. One to the right of my hand and one to the left. We're shooting him on the spot. And he said, that's what's happening if any one of you ever escape. And we make ourselves almost like a promise that we are responsible for our friends. How can we save one life and put in jeopardize 25 or even maybe more?
He wasn't a brutal killer. No, no more than other people, other SS people was it, no more. He didn't, it's just for the fun of it, you see. He wasn't a brutal killer. He thought that what all the SS thought about Jews.
And what was that?
That they were there just to work. He didn't kill them just for the fun of it, you see. And it was not a camp where people in Vernichtungslager like Auschwitz.
But there were a lot of bodies that were dug up at Plaszow. Where did they come from?
I don't know. I don't know. He killed some Jews too, natürlich. And such a camp, it's not amusing. It's not amusing, really not. I stayed often in the kitchen with my maids and always said to them, if I could do anything, I would. To all of you say, go home. But I can't do anything.
One of those maids was a young Jewish prisoner, Helena Hirsch.
Przede wszystkim był sadystą, ale w postaci pięknego człowieka to bym nie uwierzyła nigdy w takim człowieku taki szatan może się zachować. Morderca, żonny krwi. Pewnego razu Goetz, to było rano, wcześniej, rano miał wyjść, woła mnie do siebie. Oczywiście biegiem przyleciał. Wskazuje mi na rękaw, była plama, możliwe otarcie z muru, możliwe, nie mam pojęcia z jakiego powodu, było rzeczywiście, ale nieznaczna plama. To ja mówię, słuchaj, ja nie wiem, Poldek to był jego pucybut, który przygotowywał ubranie, cholewy mu czyścił. Możliwe, że on nie zauważył to. Oczywiście na to ja dostałam, zostałam spoliczkowana w taki sposób, że momentalnie ogłuchłam i zaczęło mi dzwonić w uchu niesamowicie. To ja się odzywam do niego, Herr Kommandeur, jemand läutet an der Tür. Na to on mnie szczelił po raz drugi w twarz, że mi prysła krew z ucha. Oczywiście on bez wrażenia to mi gej du Aas, du Hure. Du jüdische Verbrecherin.
You were living with a man who hated Jews.
He didn't hate them. It's too much.
Let me put it a different way. You yourself have said
Do you
that...
think Schindler liked Jews? He loved them or no? No. He was, what I said, he was a lovable opportunist. And he needed them, so he worked with them. But he didn't take them on his heart.
To the SS, then, a lovable opportunist. But his frequent visits to the camp also gave Schindler easy access to the prisoners like Helena, in her basement kitchen.
I razu pewnego przyszedł był w dobrym humorze, może lubiał pić, nie powie, że nie. I objął mnie tak. Pan rozumie, wtedy Niemiec obejmuje Żydówkę, to był Rassenschande. Ja się strasznie przelękłam. Ja się usuwam od niego. To on mówi, nie bój się. to objęcie moje i nawet ten całus, który ja złożę na twoim czole, to nie jest to, co ty myślisz. To jest ojcowski, przyjacielski pocałunek i chciałbym ci bardzo pomóc. I to tak stale przychodził. Razu pewnego wyszedł ze mną na podwórze i naprzeciwko pracowali ludzie. Zwozili kamienie. Zwożenie tych kamieni to była taka syzyfowa praca. Skończyli zwozić, to jest z powrotem wysyłali. I tak było. I on tak stoi ze mną, obejmuje mnie. Mam wrażenie, że wtedy getta nie było w kuchni, w ogóle we willi. Mam wrażenie. I powiada, ty znasz te przejścia Żydów, jak pracowali w Egipcie. Tutaj też pracują ci Żydzi. Ale ty też pamiętasz, że ich uratowano z Egiptu. Wyszli cało i zdrowi z Egiptu. Wy też zostaniecie wybawieni z tego piekła. To były jego słowa. Zawsze przychodził z pocieszeniem.
Did you get the sense that Schindler was a good Nazi?
We all were good Nazis in this sense. We couldn't be anything else. We had to believe in all these things. What could we have done? Nothing. Couldn't have do anything against it.
In early 1943, Oskar Schindler developed a most extraordinary plan. On a spare lot, in the backyard of his factory, he would build his own concentration camp for 1,000 Jews. Here, in wooden barracks, he would house his workers along with workers from neighboring factories. By exploiting his friendship with the SS and Commandant Amangerd, Jews would be brought from the arbitrary terror of Plaszow to the safety of his factory in Lipova Street, Amalia.
Of course, the conditions in Amalia were entirely different from Plaszow. And for the first time, we felt safe. We somehow knew that all the things that happened to us, like that 25 lashes and things of that sort, can never happen there. And they didn't. They never did happen. Whenever the Germans came to Amalia, somehow Schindler was able to give the message to us. Let's say somebody was cooking something, to remove everything from the stove. And even when Get came, the doors and the shutters were closed. And from the barracks where the people worked for Schindler were closed when the Germans came. And he explained to them, these are the barracks of my company. And no soldiers, no SS men ever walked into our barracks.
So people are eating, they have bread. It was like to fall on the other planet. Mr. Schindler came to the garage. They told me, the people, now is Oskar Schindler is coming. So he greets me, even he gave me his hand. I was afraid to give him a hand, to shake hands. But he told me, don't be afraid. I heard you are a good mechanic, so you will enjoy your staying here. And don't be afraid, you will never be hungry. And so I told him Polish to my friends when he went out. Tell me, he's a bluffer or it is so. So I said, no, it is so. It is so.
With the black market and cheap Jewish slave labor, the small-time pre-war salesman had become a successful businessman with a private stable. And in the evenings, rounds of drinks and parties, with his military and SS contacts. With charm and diamonds, Schindler bought security for his Jews.
Die Verständigung wurde mehr darauf zurückgeführt, dass man das bezahlen musste. Das wurde noch mit Brillanten, nicht mit Geld, nein, das waren immer kleine Geschenke von Brillanten und andere Sachen. Nicht? Aha, das musste gegeben werden. Geld hat keinen Wert. Das mussten Schmuckstücke, das mussten auserlesene Schmuckstücke sein, mit denen man das bezahlte, dass die Menschen dort bleiben. Aber diese Menschen musste mein Mann den SS bezahlen.
But Schindler himself was not above suspicion. He was arrested 3 times by the SS and spent up to a week in the cells. The charges ranged from the trivial to being involved in major black market fraud, which could carry the death penalty. But every time, his connections in military intelligence and the Armaments Inspectorate brought about his release.
Das war die Rückendeckung von der Abwehr. Und auf der anderen Seite war das der deutsche Rüstungskommando. Und das war, dass er nämlich die Juden behalten konnte, damit die Juden nicht nach Auschwitz gefahren werden. Das hat die deutsche Rüstungskommando wieder bewerkstelligt. Nur die SS musste bezahlt werden, damit sie nicht zum Schluss aus Boshaftigkeit die Menschen wegnehmen und erschießen.
Schindler, the secret agent, on Abwehr duties in Turkey. He traveled there in his Hoch sports car, and after meeting with the German ambassador, von Papen, did some sightseeing. And then later that year, he became a double agent. Budapest, capital of Hungary, was still comparatively untouched by the war, and the Jewish Relief Organization was able to operate there. Schindler traveled from Krakow, smuggled in a baggage van with newspapers, to meet the Jewish agent in Budapest, Samuel Springman. In a grand hotel, Schindler gave Springman details of the fate of Krakow's ghetto and produced as evidence instructions he'd received from Commandant Goeth about the rounding up of Jews. He then returned to Krakow with aid money for Plaszow's inmates. By the end of 1943, on the Russian front, the Germans were being forced to pull back, and in the west, the Allies had landed in Italy. In Krakow, Schindler's factory was celebrating its 4th anniversary. He now not only produces kitchenware, but ammunition for the war effort. With the war closing in on every front, the German extermination machine has speeded up in a frenzied attempt to implement the final solution. From all over Europe, Jews are being herded directly into the gas chambers and ovens of Auschwitz. Then, by mid-1944, with the Russians pushing forward into Poland, the Germans are forced to dismantle their camps near the front. Essential war industries are to be moved to safer territory. The Jewish workers will be disposed of. Schindler's haven was finally to be broken up.
In August of 1944, Schindler was ordered to reduce the size of the inmates of his camp of what was approximately 1,000 people by 2/3 and leave 1/3 as his workforce. The SS guards helped in that shipment and separation of the 700 people to be shipped to Krakow Plaszów. As the SS guards were marching in front of the people and making the selection with Schindler's help, I found myself what I thought in the wrong group, where I would be shipped out rather than remain in the Emalia works. I at that time ran forward from my line towards Schindler, and I declared to him, Herr Schindler, kein Tischler ist geblieben, which meant that there was no carpenter left in the factory. Oskar Schindler took me very seriously for my statement, and he took me by my arm and put me into the group of 300 people, and that's how I remained with the group of 300.
But Schindler had lost 700 of his Jews. A few days later, they were loaded into cattle trucks at Plaszow siding for shipment to Mauthausen death camp. On a blazing hot day, they were kept sealed in their wagons, but while Schindler was visiting Goethe, he discovered their fate. He obtained permission to have them fed, and in full view of the commandant, he ordered the trucks to be hosed down with water to cool them. For the journey, the SS guard was bribed to open the wagons at every stop. But his 300 or so survivors still had faith, although by September Emalia had shut down and the prisoners transferred to Plaszow. However, Schindler's extensive wheeler dealing had borne fruit. Production, now classified as essential to the war effort, was to be moved to the safety of Brindlitz, near his home in Czechoslovakia. He could take with him 1,000 specialist metal workers.
At that time, they made a list of people that were supposed to stay and the one that were going. So the idea was to keep all the women and the family of women together. Unfortunately, some never made it, men or women for that matter. And the list was made in a very funny way. I think everybody had something to do with it, whether it was Schindler or Mr. Bankier or the Jewish policeman or even the German engineer that worked for Schindler. A little bit of personal vendetta went into it. And this is how it happened. The people that work from the beginning, they gave their best, never made to Brindlitz and never survived.
This is Schindler's List, the list of life for the lucky 1,000. But because Schindler had lost 700 of his Jews during the August selection, there was now room for newcomers from Plaszow. In the scramble to get on it, corruption flourished. The prisoner in charge was a Goethe trustee called Marcel Goldberg.
I asked him, Marcel, would you be so kind and put me on the list? So the first question what he asked me, do you have diamonds? Do you have dollars? I said, Marcel, I don't have no diamonds. I have no dollars, but we are very good friends for so many years, from before the war. So he said to me, I don't want to use the vulgar words, but he said, you will die here. You will not go no place. Without the diamonds, without this, were diamonds, what he was taking not for anybody else, only for himself. This was his personal business.
On this list, I saw my name, Pinchira Moses, my date of birth, and as Beruf, it's written down, a metal sheet worker. I give you my word. I never put it down. I was never a metal worker. As you heard from my experience that I went to camp being a Barackenbau builder, then later I worked in the kitchen. If I would be some kind of a fanatic, or it would be years back, I would say that an angel flew down, marked down my name.
Helena Hirsch, Amon Goeth's maid, secretly offered Schindler 4,000 zlotys to get on the list. He took the money and obtained her release in a most unconventional way.
Schindler został z Goethem i zaczęli grać w karty. Nie wiem, nie znam tej gry tam, ale dość na tym, że Schindler powiedział, kto wygra, ten dostaje, to było wtedy na tę listę mnie trzeba było wziąć, a on się jeszcze wszystko nie zgadzał. Nie chciał pozwolić, żeby mnie wziąć na listę. To on mówi, kto wygra, ten dostaje tą Lenę na listę. Oczywiście grali i Schindler wygrał 14 000 złotych. To była suma wtedy. Co on mówi do niego, no więc? Co Goethe się odzywa, ja jej nie dam. To mówi, słuchaj, graliśmy, bądź fair.
Then there was Julius Madrich, another slave labor factory owner in Plaszow, who wanted to get some of his prisoners to Brindlitz with Schindler, who agreed to take 60 workers.
When Madrich came one day, he says he can send some people to Brindlitz, to Schindler, and if we want to go with our families, he He's going to take care of this, which he did. And I was one of the luckies. My wife and me, we wind up in Brinditz.
What happened, as far as you know, to the majority of workers who worked for Madrid who didn't take this option to go to Brinditz?
They went to different camps. Let's say some went to Dachau, some went to Mauthausen. Some survived, some no, like in Adekel.
Eventually, 1,100 men, women and children, all supposedly essential munitions workers, were crammed onto the list for Brindlitz. On October 15th, 1944, the 800 men left Plaszow by cattle truck. But instead of arriving at Schindler's factory to the southwest, the next day they were unloaded at Gross-Rosen concentration camp.
Oh, Gross-Rosen was really a nightmare. When we arrived at first, they opened the doors of the cattle cars. When we came out, they had the capos standing with gloves on their hands. They looked very elegant. And they herded us all to one assembly place, which they call Appelplatz. On that assembly place, the first thing they did, they asked us all to disrobe. And this was in October, it was quite cold. We all disrobed, and the next thing, they ran us into a shower. We were very apprehensive as far as the shower went. We weren't sure whether we are going to get gas or water. When the water came out, it was a great relief. They kept us all, a few hundred people, in a place which accommodated maybe 30 or 40 people. So what we did, we slept on the floor with our spread eagle legs, and we fitted one into another. This was the only way that they could fit us all into the barrack. And this is how we slept the first night. And this is how we slept the next night. On the third day, I think, the angel arrived. Oskar Schindler came. And as soon as we have seen Schindler, it was like the gates of heaven opened up for us. At that moment, everybody felt safe. If Schindler is here, then nothing will happen to us. And sure enough, a couple of days later, we were transported to Brinditz.
Accounts differ as to the exact circumstances of the men's release, whether Schindler was there or not. But 2 days after the men had reached the safety of Brindlitz, his 300 women also left Plaszow for the new camp. After 12 hours, they had only traveled 40 miles to the gates of Auschwitz.
I remember arriving to Auschwitz at night, and they opened the door from the train and they said, everybody out. So everybody got out. And we marched in silence, and right away I noticed the chimneys with fire coming out of them, and I didn't say anything. I just motioned to my sister-in-law, to my husband's sister, and showed her the chimneys. And they brought us closer and closer to the area where the chimneys were, to some barracks, I don't know exactly what it was, and they told us to get undressed completely, to put our belongings on one side, and to enter the room for a shower. And we stayed there, and we stayed there, and there was no shower, really. And because it took such a long time, the people that worked there, the Jewish people, were sure that the next morning they will really finish us off. They will put us to the gas chambers and burn us.
You know, the sky was all red around us. The smell was kind of different, you know, but we still didn't believe that those things were going on. You know, even when we were told by the Slovak women who were in Auschwitz from the very beginning, that means since 1940 or something, and they were telling us, you're not going to survive, when we asked if we could keep this of our possession or that, why are you worried about it? You're not going to live another day. And so we weren't sure what's going to happen afterwards. But still, we hoped that everything would be all right. You know, that's the optimist, the perennial optimism of the Jews, I suppose. The next day when they put us outside, Dr. Mengele came over to review the parade, and I remember people referring to him as Angel of Death. And we went through the first selection in Auschwitz. He used to ask women that were younger than myself today, "How old are you, Grandma?" Or children that were in the group, "What's your age?" And then, of course, they took the old people on one side, and the rest of us were pushed to the good side. And they took us to Birkenau, which was one part of Auschwitz, and we stayed there for 3 weeks. And through those 3 weeks, I think I must have been at least 3 times undressed naked for a selection. I was very skinny at that time, and I didn't know really which part of my body to push out more to look heavy and healthy. From the very beginning, we realized in Auschwitz that everything was meant for death, not for life. There was no soap. There was no glass in the windows. The water, of course, was freezing cold. This was November in Auschwitz. And the mud was up to our mid-calves. We had no stockings, of course, no underwear of any kind, no sanitary conditions of any kind, absolutely no toilet paper, nothing that a woman, let's say, needs for her sanitary condition. And we began to be very, very hungry because the diet was zero. So we couldn't even eat what we've got because we all developed dysentery. Some people really couldn't take it. They were emotionally not strong enough to cope with it. Some wanted to go straight on the electrical wire and commit suicide, even from our group. I don't know, maybe I was younger then and I was stronger. And one day I remember somebody came and asked, "Who knows how to knit?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And they gave me a set of needles, of course, improvised. They cut my fingers. But I was knitting. They gave me some sort of yarn, and I was knitting gloves for somebody. And whenever there was a countdown, they had to, in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, everybody out, and they counted the people. I didn't have to go out because I was the one that was making the gloves. So you see, there were really moments that you never anticipated what will save you, what will help you. We saw the other women who were even worse than us because they were longer in Auschwitz than we were. I will never forget the experience that's constantly in my mind. When one time, I don't know why, but probably I was sent with another 1 or 2 girls to bring the so-called cereal, you know, the cream of, or whatever, you know, the porridge or whatever, which was really water, hot water. And as we were walking with that from the kitchen to our barrack, there were shadows of women appeared because it was like 4 o'clock in the morning with shaven heads, already dressed in these tattered clothes of Auschwitz, and they put their bowls that they had, which they probably used for other purposes also, into our cereal and grabbed it on the way as we were carrying it. They were so terribly hungry. They had no control of their actions or their emotions or nothing. And we were thinking, my God, are we going to become like that, you know? So that's one of the most terrifying experiences, and the total feeling of hopelessness, because we didn't know. We hoped that Schindler will get us out, but how could we be sure?
In Auschwitz, Schindler's 300 women waited and hoped. But in Krakow, Schindler had been taken into custody again. An SS investigation team had arrested Commandant Amon Goeth for suspected black market crimes, and he, in turn, had implicated his friend, Oskar. It then took several days for Schindler's usual Abwehr and munitions inspectorate network to have him released. Free again, Schindler turned his attention to the women. He arranged with a Czech friend that she should travel to Auschwitz. There she met one of the senior officers, with whom she spent the night. Soon, Schindler's Jewish women were ready to be shipped out. But Auschwitz had some new inmates. There had been a disaster at Brindlitz, when in Schindler's absence, all the young boys had been rounded up, together with their fathers, and sent under guard to the same notorious death camp where their mothers now waited.
My son said to me, "Daddy, you know, I'm so sorry that you have to die because I'm a child." So now, while my son noticed in Auschwitz that some movements under the train, you could see ladies' legs, so he got some feeling, and he started whistling, our signal. So my sister had a signal. She looked through a crack in the wall of the train. It was train for horses. And she noticed my son and her son.
And all of a sudden she started to yell, "Manzi, look, Manzi, look, there are our children. There's Richard, there's Oleg. There was another little boy, Eugene, his name was Genek Ginter." And I looked through and I saw my boy. So I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to yell to him or to whistle to him or make myself that he should know that I'm here.
He started to knock on the doors. So the German said, "Vasilios, what's happened?" He said, "Listen, I see this, my son. Maybe I see my last time in my life. Please let me out." He said, "All right, go down under the train. Make believe you're doing something, you know?"
And I went under this train and I called out, "Oleg, Oleg, Oleg." And I whistled and he saw me and I saw him. And I said, "Olushu, you are hungry?" He said, "No, Mama, look, I have potatoes."
That was a pretty incredible coincidence to be at the same place at the moment. And I do recall being with my cousin, I do recall being with my uncle. We have tattoo numbers that follow each other. I even recall an instance with a boy of my age at the time who was screaming so much when he was tattooed that they had to cross out his tattoo because the man who was putting it out made an error.
For the Schindler women, at least, the ordeal was over. The only shipment of prisoners out of Auschwitz, by name, in the history of the war.
When we arrived in Brindlitz, if I remember correctly, it was very early in the morning, and it was cold and it was gray. And of course, when we got out of the cattle trains, completely dirty, and besides this, we were smeared with paint, you know, because they smeared us with paint before we left Auschwitz, so in case somebody intended to escape, would be easily spotted, you know, on the way. So we arrived, and we got off the train, and we formed the fives, you know, as usually we did, and I always had the same 5 women, you know, together. And one of my girlfriends said, "You know, look at the chimneys. We came here and they're going to gas us." And her name was Margot. And I said, "Margot, you know, they could have done it in Auschwitz. We are now coming to Schindler. I'm sure they won't do it." So they marched us to the side of the camp, and the gates were open, and we walked in, and Schindler was standing there in his little Tyrolean hat with a feather, and he was surrounded by SS officers, guards, and women guards. And he smiled at us and greeted us and says, "Look, finally you are with me, and don't worry." Even though the factory wasn't finished yet. I mean, our sleeping quarters, we slept on straw, on the floor. It didn't matter because we were with him, and we knew that from that time on, providing something unforeseen would happen, we are safe, because if it were in his power and in his... he would take care of us.
Schindler did just that, with black market food and by convincing the German military that his little operation was still essential to the war effort. The propaganda films may have shown efficient factories like Krupp's or Farben, even while the Germans were losing the war. But though Schindler too was paying wages to the SS for his Jewish slave labor, he was no Krupp or Farben.
I was assigned to the tool department. I was a tool maker. I had no idea how to make tools. I worked under a man who really was an expert in it and had 3 helpers, and neither one of the helpers knew what they were doing. None of the tools that we were making tools for big presses. None of the tools that we made were ever working. So the plant was working every day, but nothing ever came out of there. And we always wondered, how did it happen? How did the German authorities allow him to do it? What will happen if somebody comes into the plant and sees what's going on? Then I found out, it was way after the war, that Schindler was buying some of the products on the black market and delivering to the German authorities as product coming out of this factory.
Schindler's efforts notwithstanding, the Germans were not doing well. In the face of the advancing Russian armies, they continued to evacuate their death camps in Poland. On January 29, 1945, a single cattle truck of prisoners from the Goleschau camp attached to Auschwitz was dumped on the doorstep of Schindler's factory by its SS guards.
Aber die 2 sagten, wir haben einen Transport von Häftlingen, die aus dem Lager Goleschau kommen. Sagten, wenn Sie, wir sind 14 Tage am Weg, die Fabrik, wo sie bestimmt war, nehmen die Menschen nicht an. Wir können nicht mehr weiter, wir sind halb erfroren. Wenn Sie das nicht übernehmen, lasse ich den Waggon aufmachen und schieße alle zusammen und lasse sie hier. Daraufhin haben wir dann mit dem Ingenieur Schöneborn, der hat meinen Mann angerufen, auch nach Krakau, haben wir dann gesprochen. Ne? Und haben gesagt, wir werden den Transport übernehmen.
We worked for hours with picks, shovels, we poured hot water. The carloads were frozen, complete frozen. When we finally opened one up and we ran to grab somebody who we see was in pain, we, excuse me for the expression, but I cannot say it any other way than what I saw, is when we lift them up, is the skin of their behind were frozen, was ripped, and they were screaming and yelling. And when we saw the pain, we worked slowly, and we had to watch too much of hot water, then we would burn them. Too little, it didn't help.
Aber ich habe zum ersten Mal in meinem Leben Menschen gesehen, wo ich nicht wusste, ob das Frauen oder Männer sind. Ich konnte nicht erkennen, ob das sind Männer oder ob das sind Frauen. Weil die waren nur Haut und Knochen. Die Augen hatten sie leuchtend und so groß. Hier war alles eine Mumie. Das waren die Menschen, die aus dem von Goleschau gekommen sind. Krank, ohne Essen, die sind verhungert, die sind gestorben, die sind erfroren. Das kam in Brünnlitz an.
The survivors of the Goleschau truck looked like these prisoners, filmed in Belsen. None weighed more than 77 pounds, 35 kilos. For the dead, Schindler purchased a plot in the local cemetery, and they were buried with full Jewish rites. The living were fed and nursed back to a kind of normality.
Shortly before the end of the war, I remember Schindler's birthday, and I think somebody baked even a cake, and we observed his birthday on the factory itself, and we sang to him happy birthday, and he had a little speech. He was very good at it, I must tell you this. He pointed out how safe we are in that corner of the world where there is no war, and that we are really protected. And he made us stand at silence in memory of our dead people. You see, this last incident, somebody might tell you that it was a very smart trick on his part, on Schindler's part, that this was strictly propaganda for the future to save his skin. I don't know what was going through his mind. I won't tell you. Either way, these are the facts. This is what happened. What was his motivation? I don't know.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all...
On the last day of the war, was a moment I never forget in my life. Schindler set up speakers in the plant and announced that we are going to listen to Churchill's victory speech. Now, there weren't that many people who understood English. However, the atmosphere was sort of electrical. Everybody stood at attention and listened to a speech. They couldn't understand the words, but sort of they could feel the meaning of that speech. I took some English lessons before the war, and here and there I understood some passages of the speech. And it was one of the greatest moments, because at that moment we realized that we are safe, that we are home, that we survived. We did not know that we were so few of us that survived.
The dead and the living dead, survivors of more than a decade of terror. Gradually, the full enormity of what the Germans had done in the name of National Socialism emerged, as the camps gave up their guilty secrets. But while those who had only obeyed orders were being taken into custody, the Jewish prisoners of Brindlitz were planning how to smuggle their captor, Schindler, to the safety of the Americans and away from the Russians, who would, they believed, execute him on the spot.
Dr. Hirschstein, he was one of the prominent of the camp, came to me and asked me to do some very, very important job. I asked him, what is it? You were chosen, Richard, to save the life of Oskar Schindler, to take him from the camp outside and bring him to the Americans. You will do it? So I told him, yes, of course I will do it. We owe him, Oskar Schindler, this.
At 1 minute past midnight, on May the 9th, 1945, a very strange convoy joined the fleeing German armies. Schindler, with his wife and mistress in the Hoch, was followed by a truck and 2 trailers bearing a bodyguard of young Jews to protect and vouch for their former captor. They were in for a tough journey.
I was going about 50, 60 miles an hour. But afterwards, instantly we jump into a very, very big column of Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht. So I was really in a jam. And we went into the Böhmerwald, it's the Bohemian forest. And this hilly road, very hilly road, and I used very much the brakes. And after 50, 60 kilometers, I lose my brake in the car. So you can imagine with the 30 tons without brake. So I put on the two wings, two friends of mine, I gave them a big piece of wood. When I couldn't stop anymore the car with the gear. So they jump and put the big pieces of wood under the wheels, because I was in big danger. When I would make an accident with a German military car, probably they will give me a small bullet in my head. So we went about 100 more kilometers. And then we were very surprised. From the forest went out 5 Russians, Cossacks. And that I can never forget, thousands of Germans with heavy weapon. They ran away like small children, yelling, Ivan, Ivan kommt. They ran away. And the second thing I remember, the first was an officer. In pure German he said, Kameraden, with his hand, Kameraden, keine Angst, weiterfahren. Also, don't be afraid, comrades, please go ahead. In this moment, I gave my jacket to Oskar Schindler, and I told him, listen to me, you are no more director for me, you are Oskar. And I gave him we have a special hats, because I was bald-headed, and he has his hair. And so you are from a concentration camp, you should remember it. The third thing, one of the Cossacks came very near to us, and with his knife, he cut the watch of Schindler. It was a golden watch, and coated in the air, and ran away.
The German industrialist turned Jewish concentration camp prisoner. It was enough to get him and his party of Jews to the safety of the Swiss border, where this photograph was taken. Auschwitz had been liberated earlier in 1945. Among the survivors, when the Russians arrived with their film crew, were the boys who had been dumped there the previous November from Schindler's Brindlitz, including Richard Horowitz.
I was just about 5 years old when I was liberated in Auschwitz by the Red Army. And I remember quite vividly a group, a small platoon of soldiers who rounded us up, whatever children were left. And I was one of probably the youngest, in front of a gallows, to use it as a picturesque reference material. And then later on we walked through a narrow path between barbed wires. And there was a group of children and elderly people who happened to, to be there at the time. And then afterwards, not knowing where my family was, there was nobody around at the time. My mother and my sister was in another camp, and my father was made to walk to Mauthausen. And I was taken to an orphanage in Krakow.
Richard was reunited with his mother when she returned to Krakow from Brindlitz at the end of the war. She only discovered he was still alive when she saw this newsreel. In August 1946, an unrepentant Amon Goeth was put on trial for his life in Krakow. On September 13th, he was hanged for his war crimes. As for Schindler, after the war he did little with himself. In Germany he had grand schemes, but found no work. Then in 1949 he received money from a Jewish-American charity and decided to emigrate to Argentina with his wife, his current mistress, and a number of the Jews he'd saved. But in Argentina, his fortunes fared no better.
Dort hat es angefangen, dass er nicht mehr der Mann gewesen ist, was er vorher gewesen ist. Er hat nicht mehr die Willenskraft, er hat sie gehen lassen. Er hat nicht mehr den Willen aufgebracht, gegen dieses Schicksal zu kämpfen. Er hat sich schwimmen lassen, er hat nichts mehr angefangen. Das war das Ganze, die Hauptsache. Er hat gelebt, es wird schon etwas kommen. Er hat gelebt, wie die Argentinier manchmal leben. Was geht mich morgen an, heute sind wir da.
In 1958, Schindler abandoned his wife and returned to Germany. He founded a cement factory, which went bankrupt. Then, in 1962, his fortunes changed. He went to Israel for the first time. There he received a tumultuous welcome from his Jews.
Everybody of us thought that he was the only one to whom he helped with something. And suddenly it came out that everybody has a story about Schindler. The one has a story that his glasses were broken and he was desperate. He can't see anything. It was Schindler who provided him a pair of new glasses. Another woman, she had a hidden child in Poland, and he brought her up. He brought her from time to time a message from her child. A third woman, he came into the hospital, well, to the place where ill were treated, and he asked her if she needs something, and she wanted just an apple. And he brought her an apple.
Life in Israel consisted of one long celebration after another for Oscar, after the years in the wilderness. His visits became an annual event.
I'm not sure if he wanted the gratitude, but he wanted to be surrounded by people. He liked receptions, big receptions, and here he felt excellent. He wanted to have everybody around. He wanted to tell the stories, prominent people present, to repeat again and again. Well, this was Schindler. This is the man. And we had to accept Schindler as he was. Because if he wouldn't be like he was, nobody else of a normal kind of thinking was ready to do what he has done.
Israel honored Schindler. In 1963, he was only the third person to have the title Righteous Gentile bestowed on him. His tree stands in the Avenue of the Righteous, but not every survivor is so certain of his motives.
After all, to me, Schindler was still a German, a Nazi. I never gonna believe he was a Jew lover. To me, he represent German system, Nazi, and he was a guy who made money.
For 11 months of the year, Schindler lived in poverty in a one-roomed apartment in Frankfurt opposite the railway station. A movie contract came and went. The money was spent, the film not made. He lived off a small pension and handouts from the survivors. He drank heavily. Then, in autumn 1964, he was filmed by German television outside his apartment and was asked why he had intervened on behalf of the Krakow Jews.
Die Verfolgung der jüdischen Menschen im Generalgouvernement im polnischen Raum haben hier in ihren Grausamkeiten eine allmähliche Steigerung genommen. Im Jahre 39 und dann 40 mit den Judenstern und die Einschließung und Zusammenpferchung der Menschen im Ghetto haben natürlich den Sadismus in der Reinkultur erst im Jahre 41 und 42 geoffenbart, und ein denkender Mensch, der mit dem inneren Schweinehund siegreich fertig wurde, musste einfach helfen. Es war keine andere Möglichkeit.
Schindler died on October 9, 1974. His heart and his liver had finally given in.
When I heard from my friends that Oscar died, And I felt very sad, of course, because he was not so old, but he was 66. And I felt very bad, like a brother or my father died. And the people asked me to go to Frankfurt, so I told them I will go because I am very honored. First of all, I saved him from Brindlitz, and now I am honored to bring him to bring him to make the funeral in Israel, to bring him back to his home, because he told us always, my home is in Israel.
3 weeks later, in the Catholic Church on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, they gathered to bury Oskar Schindler. Jews, who'd never entered a Christian place of worship, came to honor him. But although no one could really say who was Oskar Schindler, his lasting contribution to humanity was vividly etched on those Middle European faces in the pews that day. Schindler had given his people a gift without price.
Thanks to Schindler's efforts, we survived as a family. I still have parents alive today. They are in their 80s. And we realized that we are very few survivors who survive as a family. There are very few who have parents, and all my friends who are survivors are quite envious of us, that my wife and myself have parents, and my children have grandparents.
I was the youngest person, or one of the youngest person who owes his life to, to Schindler's maneuvers. Looking at it in perspective and sort of recollecting it as an adult, there's no question that I feel certain homage to the man, whoever he was and however he did it. I mean, who cares, Life is really what counts.
When he was preparing to leave the camp on the last day of the war in 1945, the Jews of Brindlitz wanted to give Oskar Schindler a gift. One prisoner offered his gold teeth, and another fashioned them into a ring, in which was inscribed the ancient Jewish phrase, "He who saves a single soul saves the world entire."